Welcome everyone to this book launch for Dr. Henna Cundill, which is organised by the Centre for Autism and Theology. My name is Dr. Zoe Strong and I'm a researcher with the Centre for Autism and Theology. I will introduce Henna and our speakers in a moment, but I have a few words by way of introduction for those who haven't joined us before. The Centre for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 and is co-directed by Professor Grant Macaskill and Dr. Leon van Omen. We host interdisciplinary research into autism and other types of neurodivergence as they relate to theology, church and faith. So the Centre acts as a hub that brings together all those interested in how neurodiversity and theology intersect. The aim is to contribute to the academic discourse, but also to be of service to faith communities. If you want to find out more about the Centre, do take a look at the Centre for Autism and Theology website, where you can sign up to our mailing list and also find out more details on how to get involved with what the Centre is doing. You can also follow us on social media. But today it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Henna Cundill. Henna is a researcher at the Centre for Autism and Theology. Her previous project was with Autistic Christians, and she is currently researching how ADHD impacts Christian discipleship. We will hear from Henna just now, and then I will invite Professor Grant Macaskill, Dr. Krysia Waldock, Dr. Claire Williams, and Christopher Barber to respond. We hope to have some time for Q&A at the end.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks for this opportunity just to say a little bit about why I wrote this book. And I should say that contrary to the custom of a first monograph, this book is not a direct repeat of my PhD thesis. There are some sections that are carried across, but that actually only constitutes about half the material. And the reason that I've kind of gone rogue in that sense is that my thesis was a report of an action research project. And action research involves working with certain groups or communities who want to come to a better understanding of something for themselves and for their own purposes. So often in action research project, it is the research community that come up with the research question, and they then have as much input as is humanly possible into things like research methods, data analysis, and any outcomes. Now, admittedly, my PhD project didn't start that way. I began researching autism and prayer because somebody had suggested to me that prayer might be a bad idea for autistic people, and I was quite determined to prove them wrong. But when I took that research agenda to my research advisory group, which was for autistic Christians, they very quickly put me right and said, well, actually, prayer could be quite an anxiety-inducing topic for autistic people. And so they were willing to work with me in a conversational and a dialogical way to tease out why this was so, and to create a clear account of the problem, if indeed there was such a problem, and then to think together with me about ways that we might alleviate that problem. So that was what the project became, and it was what in academic circles we call a work of hermeneutic phenomenology. This is where two parties with quite different perspectives on a phenomenon, in this case autistic and non-autistic perspectives, come together to construct a shared account of the thing that is under scrutiny, in this case prayer, and anxiety about prayer. So my thesis was a description of that process. But for this book, I've then made an additional move, which is something like what qualitative researchers call a double hermeneutic. In this, I've stepped back once again from the project and myself as a researcher embedded in the project, and I've written another account of it. One that is much more concerned with representing my own perspective and what I learned from the project, what I have come to understand differently. So in that, I'm not claiming in this book to necessarily speak for autistic people. I'm speaking for myself. And when I subtitle the book, What Autistic People Teach the Church About Prayer, what I'm really saying is this is what autistic people have taught me about prayer and about quite a lot of other things too. So my intention there is not to instrumentalize autistic people, not to hold them up as objects of fascination, nor to look down on my autistic friends and co-researchers as objects of research. The objects of this research are prayer, anxiety, normative church practices, and many of my own assumptions and biases, which have been pressed, challenged, and reformed in the course of the work that I have done. So that is what the book is intended to represent. And within that lies something of my hope for those who will read this book too, that it will act as a catalyst for noticing, interrogating, and reforming certain assumptions and biases, not just about prayer, but about our whole life together in our Christian communities, a life that has sometimes served to marginalise and discourage autistic Christians and friends.
Good evening to everybody at Aberdeen and online. I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you. Thank you, Henna, for allowing me to pre-record a response to your book, which I thought was really good, by the way, having read it. My name is Dr. Krysia Waldock, and I have read through Henna's book and have 2 points around a response around praying by whose rules. So to give you a bit of background on who I am, I'm an academic spanning religious studies and neurodiversity studies. I currently work at Swansea University on a Wellcome Trust funded project there. I've been involved with the Centre for Autism and Theology for a number of years now. I currently am one of the podcast hosts for the CAT podcast. I'm also one of the EDI officers for the British Sociological Association's Sociology Religious Study Group. And I have a bit of a reputation of asking awkward questions, being a productive irritant, which frames some of the position of which I come as a social scientist who is friends with many theologians. There were 2 main points I wanted to discuss in relation and share some of the views on Henna's book. And I really, really appreciated the time that Henna spent saying that prayer is not just a talking thing and really unpacking the double empathy problem. And this is really, really important when we think about how prayer can really echo our own embodiment and our own dispositional differences. So dispositional differences is a really fancy way of saying different ways of being in and experiencing the world. Often the double empathy problem is seen as a mismatch in terms of communication styles, but actually it runs much, much deeper than that. And I really did appreciate how it was almost looking at how people in how we are as autistic people and how this actually impacts how we pray or don't pray. And I think as I read some of Henna's book, I really came to appreciate how autistic bodies and neurodivergent bodies more broadly, I would argue in many ways, how researchers found that we have a different circadian rhythm and a history of prayer being tied to the clock. I found this really struck me as being almost an expression of crypt time. So crypt time, Ellen Samuels argues, is a form of temporal justice that acknowledges the complex temporalities of bodies and minds. So it acknowledges that different people's bodies work in different ways, be it due to the impairments we have, the disabilities we face and the barriers. And it almost, to me, frames us as autistic people as part of God's wonderful diverse world and really echoes the neurodiversity paradigm, which Henna also discusses in her book. And in a way, I saw part of this being related to the neurodiversity paradigm through actually valuing all types of bodies and brains and body minds. In a way, a lot of Henna's findings and a lot of the work she did with her PAR group, of which I was one of the members, I'll let you figure out which one I might have been, gave me real fruit that there's real potential exploration for further work on autistic people and also neurodivergent people's experiences more broadly of prayer. I don't think this is just an autistic specific thing, because many of the autistic people I know are not just autistic. Many of us are also ADHD, have bendy bodies, so we have hypermobility or hypomobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Many of us are also queer as well. So there's lots of different intersecting barriers and life experiences around how we might be interacting with churches, with church groups, with home groups, with attitudes of different churches, and the way that every single church is really idiosyncratic. And I think Henna's theological action research and the theology that she unpacks behind it. It's given real opportunity for exploring neurodivergent people's lived religion, so how we express and do religion and do our theology ourselves, especially in relation to prayer. I guess also in the title of the book as well, and also in how often in church, this is very much a church thing where we're gifts to each other, we're teaching each other about things. I think what really struck me from a lot of the conversations that Henna had is that many people were an inadvertent challenge to their church, or they found the idea of doing prayer in a very set, what could be argued to very neurotypical coded way, handed down through time, creates this as a bit of a challenge to the church. And some people may then use us as almost a way to kind of teach people about different people's brains and bodies. And anyone who knows me thinks it's really, really important that we come to understand more about neurodivergent body minds, how we experience the world, the fact there's different strengths and challenges and difficulties that we may face. In fact, it's not everybody has got quite the same spiky profile going on. But it's almost when people are reading this book, it made me think that rather than disabled people being where we can share our experience into something, we need to take the approach that Henna did, where she was talking about hermeneutic, phenomenology, and Gamber's work. And it really made me think of a free area dialogue. So a means to create an environment of relationality and relationships, maybe where we are really in conversation with each other. We're curious, we want to know about how other people live. We reflect on the various privilege and power that we have and work quite slowly towards understanding rather than just being, okay, so I've done my module of teaching on disability or autism or ADHD, and that's me done. Henna spoke about many of her participants very much having their experience of prayer as a journey. And it made me almost think that when we're reading the book, that in itself is a journey. And how when we are wanting to maybe take this back to our churches and congregations as well, this is almost a start of a journey where we're engaging with and alongside people rather than just doing the book, reading it and going, yep, it's done. And I think Henna would very much agree with me. She see it as almost a way in rather than as the finished project. Thank you so much again, Henna, for letting me pre-record something for your book review. Really deeply appreciate it. As on all my slides, I always have a picture of Fudge the cat. Here she's looking very, very podgy. You can read my work at the link tree attached, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the book launch.
Yeah, so no, thanks for the opportunity to be here again and again and again. Yeah, it's nice to have the opportunity just to respond to what Henna said and to think a little bit about the book. Obviously, at the heart of this book is a topic of the communicative practice that is really at the heart of the life of faith, prayer, and also very distinctively the autistic experience of this communicative act. And therein, I think, really lies its distinctive experience, particularly to hear that that focal point being articulated in the way that Henna did. That's something for the wider church. When we started the Centre for Autism and Theology, we did so partly because there were people talking about autism and autistic people, and people talking for autistic people, but there weren't a lot of people talking to autistic people about their experience and about how that might differ. And as a result of that, there were all kinds of stereotypes of autistic deficit, and particularly around communication, interpersonal communication, and essentially about the relationship and relationality that communication is associated with. And particularly in terms of prayer, that problem that Henna raised at the beginning, that perceived problem of prayer, is very closely associated to the idea that autistic people don't relate well to other people, including to God. And so much of that turns on representations of autism that emerge from neurotypical people talking about autistic people and not talking to autistic people about their distinctive experiences. So Henna's book is wonderful on simply for gathering together and reflecting upon these accounts of the different autistic experiences of the communication with God that is involved in prayer. That's a blessing. It's a blessing to autistic people who have often struggled with the fact that our experience of prayer might not look like what the rest of the church seems to be talking about. But consequently, also, it's a blessing to everyone else who gets a little bit of an insight into these differences, and maybe in a way that allows their own different experience of prayer. The fact that they struggle perhaps with a quiet time, the fact that they struggle with praying in the way that other people seem to pray, it helps them to see that there are different ways of doing this communicative activity, this communicative practice. And there's an incredible relief that goes with that. So there's something wonderful about a book like this that reflects on that, not just as something that might help autistic people understand their own prayer life, but as something that might help everyone in the church understand what a diverse richness of prayer looks like. I'm going to finish with this little thought, which is simply to reflect on the fact that I grew up in a church that only ever sang psalms. So we didn't sing hymns, we didn't sing choruses, we just sang psalms. And the psalms are both a songbook for the church, but they're also a prayer book for the church. And one of the really interesting things about the psalms is that actually what they model for us in terms of prayer doesn't look a whole lot like our normalized accounts of what a prayer life should look like. The Book of Psalms in many ways is all over the place in terms of what it represents. And there's something wonderful about that. When we stop and think about it, it represents something about the different ways that we can pray, not just in our regular times, but through our lives. And it connects with the fact that prayer is an incredibly complex, complicated, sometimes challenging, sometimes difficult activity that will look different all the time. And this book, I think, does something wonderful in terms of capturing the distinctive experience, including the distinctive challenges for many autistic people. And there's a relief involved in just reading through these different experiences and seeing what kind of light they might cast on our own lives. I'm going to stop there. I don't want to say too much.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this wonderful presentation and launch for Henna's book. Henna's written a richly conceived book, carefully and appropriately dismantling our assumptions about autism and about faith. She reassembles those ideas with things using like shame as a critical tool to help autistic and non-autistic people understand what flourishing in prayer might look like for the church. I think it's a well-conceived research project, noting the potential and the need for investigation while managing the complexities of doing this sort of research well. And she's already explained really carefully how that's been done. I think she makes fascinating connections between prayer, rhythms, and daily habits that teach autistic people how to move faithfully to their own rhythm. The findings and analysis that I found most helpful personally and theologically rich amongst all of the rich terms concern daily prayer. Her analysis argues that the participants felt a combination of an autistic desire for certainty and rules alongside a developing sense that prayer is expected, beneficial, and in a variety of ways for them insufficient. The question Henna insightfully discerns for this part of the research is, Does a Christian have to pray every day? And when I came to this point, it was a critical juncture for me. Yes, I thought that is what I'd like to know. As someone who is a practicing Christian in the evangelical branch of the church, I've experienced the normative expectation that a daily quiet time with the Bible is constitutive and demonstrative of a suitable faith practice. The subsequent conversation about prayer in Scripture, the early church and the church fathers is fascinating and powerful. Henna debunks a number of myths and draws us into her extensive knowledge of liturgical forms and practices. She hints at the profitable ways that other intersections might engage with her ideas. For example, the fable she queries of a well-appointed home functioning as the cradle for a middle-class man to properly exercise a daily individual prayer habit is problematic for feminist, womanist, and critical class theologies as well as many others. There are assumptions made by the church's culture and popular literature that result in shame for many different people. Henna's graceful writing style drew me into the book and to the examples of church history. Such a plurality of practice of prayer across the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and into the first generations of Christianity suggests, if I'm following her well, that prayer is a flexible and adaptive practice focused upon being with God. As a charismatic scholar, I particularly resonate with the power of this idea. Charismatic and Pentecostal scholarship understands the faith lives of us Christians in that mould as comprised of a holy and active, spirit-filled community. As such, it is possible at all times for those who respond to the Spirit to be praying. Prayer for the charismatic Christian is embodied, contextual, and linked to the individual's daily life. Henna's analysis is potently compatible with this idea. She writes of the continuing dualism in theologies of prayer that suggests we must simply command our bodies to obey our brains for a fruitful prayer life to develop. Yet for autistics as well as for charismatics, such separation denies the integrated faith experience that is part of their lived reality. We are never not bodies that pray. So to enable stimming as proper prayer expression is the same as the anointing oil or the charismatic flag waver. They are fully embodied and participated ways to pray. To shake off the expectation of daily prayer does not necessarily mean less prayer, but from my perspective, more freedom in prayer. And that's what Henna brings to the conversation. Groundbreaking is an overused term, but I think this book can suitably be called it. She draws us into the light of the church's assumptions about prayer and challenges those normative and semi-conscious ideas that we have, shows alternative ways of being in the presence of God. Autistic people, I think, can use this research to understand more about themselves, about ourselves, and to begin the process of dismantling any beliefs that we have about being not good enough Christians.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this book launch. I came to autism and spirituality many years ago through a thing called ASPARG, which was run by our very own John Swinton. And that was in 2011, 2012. So I have a very long history with spirituality and prayer and autism. And I was very grateful when I was asked to participate in Henna's research group. I felt very much listened to and very much heard. There is a perception that autism is a childhood condition. Many services, many support mechanisms, including the church, are aimed at children who are autistic. When you become an adult, and I am 67 this year, going on 20, when you become an adult, particularly when you become an older adult, fewer and fewer people listen to you. So I was very grateful for the opportunity that Henna gave me through her research to actually participate in a project around prayer and autism. It's a very accessible book. It's not written primarily for academics, although it is based on an academic piece of work, a doctoral thesis, but it is accessible, which is something that, as both an autistic person and as a published author in my own right of 4 books, something that I aspire to in my own writing, that of being accessible to the reader. That is important, because if you're not accessible, then nobody's going to read it. So thank you, Henna, for the chance to be heard, be listened to. And for those of you who have read the book, I am Doug within the book. And I'm one of the 2 practicing Catholics who were interviewed and who formed part of the research group. So the next question is going to be, when is your next book coming out? Is there going to be a follow-up? Maybe a possible research will be to look at prayer in the lives of those who are non-verbal. I noticed that one of your participants was non-verbal, and that needs to be teased out and developed further. So thank you again very much for the opportunity to participate in the research and in the writing of this book. Really appreciate it. Thank you.